In 1872, for the first time in American history, the United States government established a national park in Yellowstone, California. This had come as the result of years of pushing by conservationists and explorers who worried for the safety of the awe-inspiring lands that existed across the country. The Industrial Revolution was steadily pushing industry and urbanization into nature, mowing down forests and polluting as it went. Over the next 40 years, conservation efforts would continue to fight for preserving the natural beauty of our country and succeed in adding 12 more national parks. Officially made a national park in 1872, Yellowstone spans over 1 million acres across Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. President Grant established it as preserved from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within. It came as the result of the promotion of a bill by explorers to protect it, breaking the precedent of transferring public land to private ownership, establishing the start of federally protected lands, and paving the way to dozens of national parks across the country. An important step on the way to national parks was the Forest Management Act. In 1891, President Harrison signed into law the Forest Management Act, which created federally reserved lands for logging because of worries about the effect of Western expansion on national forests, forest fires, and timber regulation. The act authorized the president to set aside land and protect forests. Later, President Roosevelt would use it to greatly multiply the amount of federally protected land in the country. The 1901 inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt ushered in a new era of federal land conservation.
Teddy Roosevelt was a great lover of the outdoors. Before he was president, he actually lived in the Badlands for 2 years and hunted big game for sport. Despite him killing and shooting animals, he lamented the loss of habitats and nature that he saw. When he became president in 1901, one of his main concerns was actually with the conservation of the environment. During his term as president, he protected about 230 million acres of public land by creating 5 new national parks, along with dozens of other national monuments, sanctuaries, and forests through the Antiquities Act that he passed. Because of his ideologies, the preservation of nature became more prevalent while he was president, and more Americans realized the importance of conserving nature.
The Antiquities Act of 1906 was one of the most important steps in preserving and protecting important land in the country. It was the first general legal protection of cultural resources in the United States. It set aside historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated upon the lands owned or controlled by the United States. It gave the president the ability to declare these lands national monuments to be preserved as public resources. President Roosevelt used this act for the first time on September 24th of that year to create Devil's Hole National Monument in California. 4 years prior to the Antiquities Act, President Roosevelt had passed the National Reclamation Act, which reallocated money made by selling lands owned by the government. This money went to the creation of the Bureau of Reclamation Services, which built dams and irrigation systems that provided water to the West, which allowed more land to be sold and more money to be put towards preserving land. Also as a result of the National Reclamation Act, construction began on the Owens Valley Aqueduct in 1908 on land taken from Native American tribes. Construction finished 5 years later, and the aqueduct then became controversial over its draining of the water in Owens Valley. The next year in 1903, President Roosevelt went camping with John Muir, a fellow conservation enthusiast. A Scotsman, Muir had explored the California wilderness and settled down outside of what would become Yosemite National Park in 1868. He then became known across the country for publishing articles about the wilderness in Century magazine. For the past 3 decades, Muir had been living around Yosemite. During that trip, Muir convinced President Roosevelt to protect the Yosemite area by expanding the national forests. After this journey out west, Roosevelt returned to Washington reinvigorated to pursue federal conservation. He established the U.S. Forest Services in 1905, headed by Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot had risen to prominence among the conservationist movement as chief of the Department of Agriculture's Division of Forestry, the precursor to the U.S. Forest Services. Perhaps one of the greatest failures of progressivism was Hetch Hetchy, located in Yosemite National Park. It marks the only time in American history a city has used a national park's resources. San Francisco built a dam on the Hetch Hetchy Valley, flooding the valley under hundreds of feet of water.
The building of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir was quite a controversial topic between conservationists and those who were in favor of American development. Previously untouched by humans, the building of Hetch Hetchy Reservoir is often seen as a symbol of negligence towards nature. One side of the argument was that San Francisco, a city that was growing at a fast pace, desperately needed water due to their frequent water shortages, and Hetch Hetchy was an ideal location to build a reservoir. This led to some debate, as many conservationists, including John Muir, opposed the building of the dam, and as a result, the Organic Act was passed in order to prevent anything of the sort from happening again.
In fact, their lobbying is one of the reasons that the National Park Service exists. The National Park Service was created by the National Park Service Act, passed in 1916.
In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Organic Act, also known as the National Park Service Act, and created the National Park Service. This federal bureau protects and regulates national parks, monuments, and reservations. The Organic Act was significant in that it unified all of the national parks under one service, as before every national park had been individually managed. The first director of national parks was Stephen Mather. He became very involved with conservation when he met John Muir in the Sequoia National Park. The low quality of the park motivated him to work on reforming and protecting national parks. He set the National Park Service on the path to making the parks great and accessible to the public so that everyone could enjoy their beauty.
Since the establishment of the National Park Service, the number of national parks in the country has increased to 58. Millions of people from across the country come to experience the beauty and wonder of the national parks each year. Their continued existence is a tribute to the legacy of Teddy Roosevelt and the many conservationists who work to preserve our nation's rich natural history.